You might have noticed that during the course of this week, we've been focusing really on the pandemic in the last 24 hours, but then also on the politics of councils and metros this week. But in the National Assembly, an important development around employment equity laws. The National Assembly passing a change to the Employment Equity Amendment Bill. It would see government, from what I can see, having more powers over companies that don't employ more black people, more women, and more people living with disabilities. Abigail Butcher is an employment associate at the law firm Cliff Decker Hoffmeyer. Abigail, good afternoon to you. As I understand it, up until now, the legislation's been, well, it sort of said companies must set targets in a way. This bill, this change, seems to make a change. It will allow government to ban companies from doing business with the state and to fine them. How significant is all of this?
Thanks, Stephen. Quite significant. And I think that so previously what we had was companies with designated employers defined in terms of the Act, which is companies who employ more than 50 people or who employ less than 50 people but reach specific annual turnover thresholds. They needed to submit to the Department of Labour employment equity plans. And those employment equity plans had to comply with specific targets in relation to both provincial and national members of the economically active population. Now what's happening is that the Employment Equity Amendment Bill is saying the minister has a discretion to implement sectoral specific numerical targets for the employment of designated groups. So what we're essentially looking at is the Minister of Labour saying, well, this is the blanket approach, or these are the specific numerical targets I'm going to set in this specific sector. And designated employers are going to be expected to comply. And as you said, those consequences are quite far-reaching.
Okay, so in other words, for the first time, really, this is now legislation with teeth.
Well, this is the idea. But I think it's quite interesting it's the legislation's adopted quite a carrot and a stick approach. So the stick approach, obviously, as you're saying, has got a bit more teeth. And that's arisen because we haven't reached the kind of transformation from a racial or gender perspective in workplaces that we've wanted before. But what the bill also does is companies have had quite a response to the proposed bill in the sense that they're saying it's extremely onerous and strict legislative provisions that they now are required to comply with in circumstances where COVID has crippled most businesses, and they're saying most of their energies need to be focused on business efforts. So what the bill also does is it seeks to change the definition of a designated employer. So previously, as I said, designated employers over 50 employees, or someone who employs less but meets an annual threshold turnover. In these situations now, a designated employer is only a company who employs over 50 employees. So it's essentially what we can call relief, potentially, to small and medium enterprises that are participating in the economy to say, well, you don't now have to comply with these sectoral specific targets, and providing them a bit of relief. Is this counterintuitive? Well, we would argue yes. So in our piece written for the Women's Report, which is published by the University of Stellenbosch Business School, we make the argument that this amendment to the definition of a designated employer really takes away from the point, we think, and potentially has the potential to negatively impact transformation that already exists in smaller and medium enterprises.
Okay, so I mean, you're talking specifically about women in this case. Why is it not going to work then, in your view?
So at the moment, the statistics look quite bleak in respect of the way that women are currently represented in workplaces. So black women, for example, make up 41% of unemployment statistics in South Africa. And we've only seen a 6% increase of the number of women that participate, that are part of the economically active population in South Africa since '94. So we've got 27 years where women's participation in the workforce has been minimal. What we're also seeing is that where women are better represented is in semi-skilled or unskilled labor. And so we're not seeing the kind of representation in executive management, higher leadership positions. So while women might be brought into the market, they're not necessarily finding ways to come up in the market because of these barriers that exist in the workforce. Those barriers aren't necessarily just based in non-compliance with legislation. So we think it might not work, or it has the potential not to work, because in the absence of societal transformation, in the absence of creating more employment for greater, members of the population, and also in the absence of a change in the way that women are defined and perceived in certain cultural and religious groups, we're not going to see the kind of transformation that we're looking for simply by the imposition of strict legislation.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, we often, and we see this happen in our law often, I mean, people try and change the law to change a problem. So we have a problem with underage drinking. Let's change the legal drinking age from 18 to 21. Doesn't necessarily work. We've seen other societies, if I may say, that are richer than ours and have less gender inequality than ours, trying very hard to change this as well. Some countries, I think Sweden might have been first, Sweden's often first, saying that you have to have a third of your board members being women, for example. I mean, those kinds of things sometimes work, sometimes they don't. You're suggesting the law just isn't enough.
Well, I mean, you take the example of Australia, which we consider in the report. They introduced their first legislation in relation to gender inequality in 1965. And they've now introduced subsequently even stricter legislation, which has quite an interesting public shame element, where companies, when to the extent that they're non-compliant, they're published on the regulator's website to say you're non-compliant, and certain alerts go out. And even taking that into account, they're still not seeing the kind of transformation they want in workplaces. And in fact, the sexual harassment statistics have skyrocketed, notwithstanding the implementation of that legislation.
So what would work? And Abigail, I mean, I realize I'm asking you an impossible question, because every year the Employment Equity Commission releases reports. And, I mean, before the pandemic, and I made the point at the start of this, we haven't spent enough time discussing this in the last 18 months, but white men still, you go into Santon boardroom, you're going to see people like me, frankly. And this just doesn't seem to be changing. So, I mean, do we need to go outside the law? Do we need to incentivize? I mean, you put a profit motive to something. Maybe that'll make a change. I don't know how we would do that. That gets back to the idea of cutting people off from doing business with the state. It's quite a big stick in a way, and a carrot. I mean, are there other suggestions on the table here?
I do appreciate that you said it's an impossible question, because the legislation needs to stand. So obviously it plays a significant role. But we need to focus on socioeconomic upliftment. So, and you say the boardroom is most likely going to look like you, but also most likely look like me, in the sense that black women are severely underrepresented in boardroom spaces. And so it's going to take, number one, socioeconomic upliftment. So, skilling up certain communities, providing them with the access, because it's not that the tools aren't there. It's not that the brains aren't there and the ability to perform the work. It's that the infrastructure is just simply not there for black women in particular to access these spaces. And so it becomes I was previously asked a question to say, well, how have we gotten here? Why does this problem exist that we now have to, implement this extremely strict legislation? And I think it's because, as we've seen in our history, going from apartheid, the implementation of laws promising equality haven't necessarily translated into socioeconomic equality. And I think the same principle applies in the way that women are represented in the workforce and gender inequality.
Abigail Butcher, thank you very much indeed. Employment Associate at the law firm Cliff Decker Hoffman. I do appreciate the time this Friday afternoon.